It was a cold November evening when Robert Mitchell, owner of a $200 million pharmacy chain, walked incognito into one of his stores in South Chicago. He wanted to see how customers were treated when the owner wasn't watching, but what he witnessed stopped him cold. A young mother with a baby in her arms was returning an unopened pack of diapers, tears streaming down her face as she counted quarters and dimes. The pharmacist, instead of showing compassion, humiliated her in front of everyone, saying poor people shouldn't have children if they can't afford them. Robert was about to intervene when he heard the woman whisper to her baby, "Daddy will be home from the hospital soon, sweetheart." That's when he recognized who this woman really was, and what he did next changed not only her life, but transformed American healthcare retail forever. Robert Mitchell was 52 years old and had everything money could buy. His chain, United Pharmacies, comprised 200 stores across the Midwest, an empire built over 20 years of ruthless business acumen. That November evening, he had decided to conduct what he called ghost inspections, unannounced visits to his pharmacies to verify customer service standards. He parked his modest Honda Civic, a car he used specifically for these occasions, outside the pharmacy on South Halsted Street, in one of Chicago's rougher neighborhoods. It was an area of housing projects from the 1960s, immigrants, working-class families, not his usual world of Lakeshore Drive penthouses and dinners at the Chicago Club. Entering the pharmacy at 8:45 p.m., he immediately noticed the tense atmosphere. About a dozen customers were waiting, most with the tired look of people who had just finished a factory shift or cleaned offices downtown. The fluorescent lighting gave everyone a sickly pallor, and the smell of disinfectant couldn't mask the dampness seeping from the walls. That's when he saw her. A young woman, no more than 28, stood at the counter with a baby of about 6 months in her arms. She wore a worn coat that had seen better days, her brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. The baby, wrapped in a checkered blanket, slept against her chest. The woman had placed an unopened pack of diapers on the counter and was speaking quietly with the pharmacist, a man in his 40s with an immaculate white coat and an expression of barely concealed annoyance. Robert moved closer, pretending to browse the shelves, but actually listening to every word. The young mother was explaining that she needed to return the diapers. She had bought them 3 days ago, but now needed that money for urgent medication. She pulled a crumpled receipt from her pocket and placed it on the counter with hands that trembled slightly. The pharmacist, Robert read the name tag, Dr. Julian Fraser, shook his head with a sarcastic smile. He raised his voice, apparently to ensure everyone present could hear, saying the pharmacy wasn't a pawn shop, that people should think before spending money they don't have. The woman lowered her gaze, holding the baby tighter. From her worn purse, she pulled out a plastic bag and began emptying onto the counter a handful of coins. Quarters, dimes, nickels, even pennies. She counted them with the desperate precision of someone who knows every cent matters. Robert felt his blood boil when Fraser pushed the coins back toward her with disgust, saying loudly that poor people shouldn't have children if they can't even afford diapers. Some customers nodded in agreement. Others looked away, embarrassed. It was at that moment the woman whispered to the baby, perhaps to comfort herself more than the child, "Don't worry, sweetie. Daddy will be home from the hospital soon. The doctor said the surgery went well. We just need to hold on a little longer." Robert froze. He looked more carefully at the woman, and a memory exploded in his mind. That voice, those green eyes, it was Elena Wilson. He recognized her despite the years and the exhaustion marking her face. Elena, the daughter of his first mentor, Professor Samuel Wilson, the man who had loaned him the money to open his first pharmacy when no bank would take a chance on a kid from the South Side. Professor Wilson had died 10 years ago, and Robert had lost contact with the family, too caught up in his corporate ascension. And here she was, little Elena, whom he remembered as a brilliant medical student full of dreams, reduced to counting change for diapers. Robert remained frozen as memories flooded over him. Professor Samuel Wilson hadn't just been his mentor, he'd been a second father. When Robert was a kid from the projects with dreams of becoming a pharmacist, Samuel had seen something in him that even he didn't see. He had loaned him $50,000, his entire retirement savings, to open his first pharmacy. Money is just a tool, Samuel had told him that night 30 years ago. Use it to build something that helps people, not just to get rich. Robert had promised he would never forget. But promises, he had learned, are easy to make, and even easier to forget when success intoxicates you. Now he watched Elena gathering her coins with silent dignity, while Fraser continued his tirade about how certain people should be ashamed to bring children into the world they can't support. The baby woke and began crying softly, and Elena rocked him, whispering words of comfort. Robert noticed other details. Elena's shoes had soles coming apart, held together with duct tape. Her purse had a broken zipper closed with a safety pin. But it was her hands that told the cruelest story. Hands that once played piano at university concerts were now rough, with broken nails and the marks of someone who had done hard labor. Another customer, a man in a suit and tie, joined Fraser's chorus, commenting that with all the welfare the government gives out, certain people always find a way to complain. An elderly lady added that in her day, people managed without making a fuss. Elena didn't respond, just kept counting her coins. She reached $15.70. The diapers cost $18. She looked at Fraser with eyes that asked for mercy without words. The pharmacist shook his head, visibly enjoying his small power. That's when Robert noticed something else. Elena had a hospital bracelet on her wrist, the kind they give ICU visitors. Her husband must be seriously ill. They had probably lost the family's main income, and she was trying to hold the pieces together. Robert approached the counter. Before he could stop himself, the words came out, "I'll take the diapers. Actually, I'll take 3 packs." Elena turned, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was no recognition in her gaze, only surprise and distrust. Robert understood that years of hardship had taught her not to trust the kindness of strangers. Fraser looked at him with annoyance, clearly irritated by the interruption of his power display. But when Robert pulled out his wallet and placed a $100 bill on the counter, the pharmacist's attitude changed immediately. Money had that power. It transformed tyrants into servants. Elena protested weakly, saying she couldn't accept, that she didn't know him. Robert insisted, saying only that he understood what it was like to have a young baby. While Fraser prepared the diapers with sudden efficiency, Robert noticed something else on the counter. A prescription Elena had placed there. Antibiotics and painkillers, probably for her husband. Without thinking, Robert told Fraser to fill the prescriptions too. This time, Elena protested more strongly, saying it was too much, that she couldn't let a stranger spend so much on her. Tears began rolling down her face. Robert placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes we have to accept help," he said gently. "One day, when things are better, you'll help someone else." While Fraser prepared the medications, Robert observed the other customers. Those who had judged Elena now looked away, some with shame, others with annoyance at being silenced. The elderly lady muttered something about rich people spoiling the poor. Robert walked Elena out of the pharmacy, carrying the bags with diapers and medications himself. She walked in silence, the baby asleep again in her arms. Outside, the cold November air cut through their lungs, and the streetlights created pools of yellowish light on the wet sidewalk. Elena stopped next to an old Ford Focus parked crookedly, with a window held up with plastic wrap. She turned to Robert, and for the first time, really looked at him. There was a moment of silence. Then her eyes widened. "Robert Mitchell." He nodded, suddenly unable to speak. Elena swayed, had to lean against the car. Recognition brought with it an avalanche of emotions: surprise, embarrassment, shame. She tried to take back the bags, stammering that she didn't know, that if she had known who he was, she never would have. Robert stopped her gently. He asked her to tell him what had happened, promising he wasn't there to judge. Elena hesitated, then, perhaps from exhaustion or desperation, began to speak. After her father's death, she had finished medical school specializing in pediatrics. She had met Marcus, an engineer. They got married. Everything seemed perfect. Then the economic crisis hit. Marcus lost his job. She got pregnant. They used all their savings to get by. Marcus found odd jobs, but then, 6 months ago, while working at an off-the-books construction site, a beam fell on him. Head trauma, 3 weeks in a coma, multiple surgeries. He survived but needed constant rehabilitation. Insurance wouldn't cover anything because he was working under the table. Elena had to leave the hospital to care for him and the baby. They lived on his disability pension and whatever cleaning jobs she could do when the neighbor could watch Marcus and the baby. As Elena spoke, Robert felt a mix of anger and shame growing inside him. Anger at the system that had allowed this. Shame at having become part of that system, at having forgotten his origins and the people who had helped him. He remembered a conversation with Samuel, Elena's father, shortly before he died. Samuel had asked him to look after Elena, to help her if she ever needed it. Robert had promised he would, but then Samuel died, and he got lost in his expanding empire, in acquisitions, in quarterly profits. Elena finished her story and stood silent, holding the baby as if he were the only solid thing in a crumbling world. Robert looked at the pharmacy behind them, the neon lights making everything look sick and artificial. He thought of Fraser in there, probably already forgetting the episode, returned to his daily petty tyranny. He made a decision. Not one of those calculated decisions he made in board meetings, but one that came from a place inside him he had sealed off years ago, when success had become more important than compassion. He told Elena to wait there, that he'd be right back. She protested, said he'd already done too much, but Robert was already heading back into the pharmacy. He went straight to the back office, ignoring Fraser's protests. He found what he was looking for: corporate documents, records, everything confirming what he already knew. This was one of his pharmacies. Fraser followed him into the office, demanding to know what he thought he was doing, threatening to call security. Robert turned and looked at him with glacial calm. "I'm Robert Mitchell, the owner, and you're fired." The color drained from Fraser's face. He began stammering apologies, saying he didn't know, that he was just applying company policy. Robert silenced him with a gesture. He called his assistant, arranging for Fraser to be escorted out immediately and for the assistant manager to take over. But he wasn't finished. That night, Robert didn't sleep. Sitting in his study in his Lincoln Park mansion, surrounded by symbols of his success, awards, photos with politicians and celebrities, an oil portrait that made him look like a modern-day robber baron, he thought about Elena and how many other Elenas were out there. At 3 a.m, he called his chief operating officer. "David, call a board meeting for tomorrow morning. Emergency." David protested it was Saturday, that board members were scattered across the country. "Video conference then. 9 a.m. It's important." The next morning, facing 12 perplexed faces on the screen, Robert announced what he called the Samuel Wilson Project, in honor of his mentor. Every pharmacy in the chain would establish a fund for customers in need. 20% of profits would go toward free medications for those who couldn't afford them. Every pharmacist would be trained not just in pharmaceutical chemistry, but in empathy and social services. The board exploded in protest. Stock prices would crash. Investors would withdraw. It was commercial suicide. Robert listened patiently, then said simply, "It's my company. We're doing this." But his actions didn't stop there. He tracked down Elena, who initially refused any further help. Robert was persistent. He offered her a job as a medical consultant for the new project, something she could do from home while caring for Marcus.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
When she protested it was disguised charity, he showed her the plans. He genuinely needed someone with medical experience and social sensitivity to make the project work. In the following months, the Samuel Wilson Project transformed United Pharmacies. At first, there was resistance. Some pharmacists quit, not wanting to play social workers. Stock prices did indeed fall. Business journals wrote about Mitchell's entrepreneurial suicide. But then something unexpected happened. Stories began to spread. A single mother who received free insulin for her diabetic son. An elderly man who no longer had to choose between medications and food. An immigrant family helped during a medical emergency. Social media amplified these stories. Pharmacies with heart went viral. Customers began deliberately choosing United Pharmacies, willing to pay a little more, knowing they were contributing to the social fund. Young idealistic pharmacists applied to work there, attracted by the social mission. Elena became the face of the project. Her story, told with her permission, touched thousands of people, not as a charity case, but as an example of how anyone could find themselves in difficulty and deserved dignity and help. She organized support groups in the pharmacies, free health education programs, collaborations with social services. Marcus, Elena's husband, slowly improved. The rehabilitation paid for by the special fund Robert had created worked miracles. After 8 months, he could walk with a cane. After a year, he found part-time work as a consultant, able to work from home. Robert often visited pharmacies incognito, but now for different reasons. He no longer looked for inefficiencies to eliminate, but stories of humanity to celebrate. He saw pharmacists hugging crying customers, organizing collections for families in need, becoming reference points for their communities. 2 years after that November evening, Robert found himself in court. A group of minority shareholders had sued him for irresponsible management of the company, claiming the Samuel Wilson Project violated fiduciary duty to investors. The courtroom was packed. On one side, lawyers in $1,000 suits represented foreign investment funds. On the other, Robert with his legal team, but also dozens of ordinary people. Customers who had been helped by the project, pharmacists who believed in the new mission, Elena and Marcus with their now 2.5-year-old child. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened for 3 days to contrasting testimonies. The plaintiff's financial experts painted a picture of fiscal irresponsibility, of profits diminished by 30%, of lost expansion opportunities. They showed graphs, projections, market analyses demonstrating how Robert was destroying shareholder value. When the defense's turn came, Robert did something unexpected. Instead of having his financial experts speak, he called ordinary people to testify. Maria, a retired teacher who, thanks to free medications, could afford to see her grandchildren. Joseph, a factory worker who had been able to treat his daughter's leukemia. Dozens of stories, each a human face behind the numbers. Then Elena spoke. She told not just her story, but how the project had created a solidarity network. Pharmacies had become de facto community centers, places where people found not just medicine, but understanding, support, hope. She spoke of suicides prevented, families saved from despair, dignity restored. The last to testify was Robert himself. He didn't speak of profits or losses, but of his father, who died when he was 15 because he couldn't afford heart medication. He spoke of Samuel Wilson, who had believed in a kid from the projects. He spoke of how success without purpose was just an empty accumulation of numbers. Yes, profits have decreased, he admitted, looking the judge in the eyes. But we've saved lives. We've restored hope. We've proven that capitalism can have a heart. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty. The judge retired to deliberate. They were the 3 longest hours of Robert's life. When she returned, the courtroom was in total silence. The verdict was historic. The judge ruled that while recognizing fiduciary duty to shareholders, a company also had social responsibilities. The Samuel Wilson Project, if managed with transparency and criteria, fell within managerial discretion. Furthermore, the judge noted, recent data showed a recovery. Positive publicity and customer loyalty were offsetting initial losses. But the real victory came afterward. Leaving the courthouse, Robert was surrounded by journalists. One asked if he felt vindicated. Robert looked at Elena and Marcus, holding hands with their child, then at the dozens of people who had come to support him. "It's not vindication," he said. "It's redemption. Mine, the company's, maybe capitalism itself." That evening, Robert had dinner at Elena and Marcus's home, a modest but clean apartment in a working-class neighborhood, light years from his mansion. They ate spaghetti with tomato sauce and drank wine from the discount store. Little Leonard played at their feet with wooden blocks. Marcus, who now walked almost normally, raised his glass for a toast. "To Samuel Wilson, whom I never met, but who saved my family through you." Robert felt tears sting his eyes. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time since he'd become rich, he felt truly wealthy. 5 years after that night at the pharmacy, Robert Mitchell was about to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for social entrepreneurship. The Kennedy Center was full of dignitaries, entrepreneurs, journalists. Cameras were broadcasting live nationally. But Robert wasn't focused on the medal. He was looking at the front row, where the people who really mattered to him sat. Elena, now National Director of the Samuel Wilson Project, elegant in a simple but dignified dress. Marcus, completely recovered, who had founded a cooperative to help other injured workers. Little Leonard, now 7 years old, quietly playing with an astronomy book. The Samuel Wilson Project had become a model studied in business schools. Other pharmacy chains had started similar programs. The government was considering tax incentives for companies adopting compassionate capitalism models. United Pharmacies, after the initial decline, was now the most profitable pharmaceutical company in America, with loyal customers who chose them for values beyond products. When they called Robert to the stage, he walked slowly, thinking about the journey. The kid from the projects who sold counterfeit drugs to survive. The young pharmacist who had sworn to help people. The entrepreneur who had lost his way in success. The man who had found his soul again in a suburban pharmacy. In his speech, Robert didn't talk about business strategies or economic models. He told the story of a November evening, of a mother counting change for diapers, of a cruel pharmacist, of a promise made to a dead mentor, and almost forgotten. "True success," he said, looking at the camera, knowing millions were watching, "isn't measured in quarterly profits or stock prices. It's measured in the faces of people we help, in lives we touch, in dignity we restore. Every company, every successful person has a duty to give back, not as charity, but as justice." He spoke of Julian Fraser, the pharmacist he had fired, not with anger, but with understanding. Fraser had been trained by a system that valued efficiency over empathy, profit over people, the system Robert himself had helped create and perpetuate. "It's not enough to fire the Frasers of the world," he said. "We must change the system that creates them. We must teach that compassion isn't weakness, but strength, that empathy isn't luxury, but necessity, that true profit includes community well-being." When he finished, the auditorium exploded in applause that lasted 5 minutes. But Robert was looking only at Leonard, who from the front row was smiling and applauding with the enthusiasm of a child proud of his Uncle Robert. After the ceremony, while everyone crowded at the reception, Robert slipped out of the theater. He walked through the streets of Washington until he reached a small neighborhood pharmacy. He went in and bought a pack of diapers, not because he needed them, but to remember. The young pharmacist recognized him and got emotional, saying how much she admired what he had done. Robert put a hand on her shoulder. "Always remember," he said, that behind every customer is a story, behind every request is a need, behind every difficulty is a person who deserves respect and compassion. If you remember that, you'll never be just a pharmacist. You'll be a healer, in the true sense of the word. He walked out into the Washington night, the diapers under his arm. He would donate them to the first hospital he encountered. But first, he stopped for a moment, looking at the sky. Somewhere up there, he thought, Samuel Wilson was smiling. The circle had closed. The kid from the projects who had received help had become the man who helped. The promise made to a dying mentor had been kept, even if years late, and a November evening in a suburban pharmacy had changed not just individual lives, but an entire system. As he walked home, Robert thought of all the pharmacies across America where at that moment someone was receiving free medications, where a pharmacist was hugging a crying customer, where dignity was being restored one prescription at a time. The true monument to Samuel Wilson wasn't a plaque or a statue. It was every act of kindness, every moment of compassion, every life saved by the project bearing his name. And that, Robert now knew, was worth more than all the profits in the world. The empire he had built with ambition and ruthlessness had been saved and transformed by something much more powerful: love for others, the memory of a debt of gratitude, and the awareness that true success is measured not in what you accumulate, but in what you give. And it all started with a mother returning diapers and a man who finally saw beyond the numbers, recognizing the human face behind every statistic. 10 years later, Leonard Wilson, now 17, was about to enter college. He had chosen economics and management with a focus on social entrepreneurship. When asked in the interview what motivated him, he told the story of his mother in a pharmacy, of a man who chose compassion over profit, of how a moment of crisis became the beginning of a revolution. "I want to continue what Robert Mitchell started," he said. "I want to prove that the business of the future isn't one that extracts value from society, but one that creates it. Not one that exploits vulnerability, but one that builds resilience." Robert, now 62, sat on the committee as an external member. When Leonard finished speaking, Robert had to turn away to hide his tears. The circle hadn't just closed. It had multiplied, creating waves that would continue expanding for generations. Outside the university, Elena waited for her son. She was no longer the desperate woman of that November night. She had become one of the most influential voices in the movement for accessible health care in America. But when she looked at Robert, she still saw the man who had chosen to see beyond the surface, who had recognized humanity in a moment of desperation. "Thank you," she said simply, as she did every time they met. "No," Robert replied, as always, "thank you. You saved me from myself." Nordines, and as the sun set over Chicago, illuminating the city of broad shoulders in gold and shadow, 3 generations united not by blood, but by compassion, looked toward a future where profit and humanity weren't in conflict, but in harmony. The pharmacy on South Halsted was still there, now run by a young pharmacist who had chosen that job after watching a documentary about the Samuel Wilson Project. On the wall, a simple plaque: "In this place, one November night, humanity won over greed. May it always win." And it did win, one prescription at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one life saved at a time. Like if you believe true success is measured in helping others, comment with your experience of solidarity received or given. Share to inspire more entrepreneurs to put humanity before profit. Subscribe for more stories of redemption and social transformation. Sometimes it takes just a moment to change a life. Sometimes it takes a life to understand a moment. But always, always, compassion is the key that opens doors money can't even touch. Because in the end, we won't be remembered for what we accumulated, but for what we gave. Not for the profits we generated, but for the tears we dried. Not for the power we wielded, but for the dignity we restored.